Damaged Defenders by Scherzad. Chapter 110. Aunt May and Steve. May made her way to the Avengers Common Use Kitchen and, boggled a little bit. For one, the place was huge. For two, it had, just about literally, every kitchen appliance, utensil, and cookpot/frying pan known to man, the vast majority of which showed no sign they'd ever been used, which, while it didn't surprise May, still bothered her. Oh well, some of it would definitely get used today. She had decided to do her casserole variant on beef stroganoff, mostly because it was the sort of dish that most people would like. Not many people turned their noses up at beef, cheese, and noodles. Her version also had the benefit of being the sort of stick-to-your-ribs feeling meal that folks with high metabolisms and increased calorie needs would adore. That, some crusty homemade bread, a few vegetable side dishes, and berry pies for dessert ought to fill everyone up nicely. First things first, however, the tomato sauce that would go in the stroganoff casserole. About the time that May found and started chopping up quite a pile of tomatoes, Darcy walked in. "Hello, Miss Parker," Darcy said. "Anything I can do to help?" "Call me May, dear," May told her. "And actually, yes, there is. I'm making a tomato sauce, so if you wouldn't mind assisting with the tomatoes." "Sure thing," Darcy said, grabbing a cutting board and knife. She eyeballed the pile of tomatoes that May had found. "We may need Jarvis to get more tomatoes. The gang can put away kind of frightening amounts of food." May was willing to take her word for it, since Darcy had cooked for the group a few times. She gazed up at the ceiling. "Jarvis, if you would be so kind as to locate us some more tomatoes, the fresher the better." "Of course, Miss Parker," Jarvis said. "I can have a suitable amount delivered within the hour." Once the first load of tomatoes had been cut up and was in the biggest container May could find to wait until the rest of the tomatoes arrived and could get the same treatment, she switched her attention to making the bread. Darcy moved with her, and the two of them worked together to get a full half-dozen loaves made. May did a couple different kinds. There was a flat bread that would work well with a stroganoff casserole for the folks that liked to sup up juices, a small loaf of black bread just for Natasha, and 4 loaves of multigrain bread. May also made a half-dozen pie crusts that went in the refrigerator to set. About the time they got all of that done or set aside to rise, the rest of the tomatoes arrived. Once they had all the tomatoes chopped up, May started working on the rest. That is, chopping and cooking the onions and other veggies, and then adding her secret seasonings that went into the tomato sauce. Once that was done, she transferred it to the biggest pot she could find that would still fit on a burner on the stove, and dumped in the tomatoes, then left the lot to simmer for the next few hours. About halfway through, once the tomatoes had broken down into an actual sauce, she'd add more tomatoes, chopped into larger pieces than the first bunch, and seasonings to give the sauce the chunky texture she preferred to use in the stroganoff casserole. Next came the filling for her mixed berry pies. A small, relatively speaking, portion of each of the 4 pies, strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries, got made into the sauce, which got poured over the rest. May halved, or quartered as necessary, the largest of the strawberries, but other than that, and removing stems and leaves, everything got tossed into the sauce, as is, to marinate for a few hours, before getting put into the pie tins. Once that was done, May checked, and kneaded, the bread dough, then was basically done for the next 2 hours while the sauce simmered and the pie filling marinated. She still needed to keep an eye on everything, of course, but that was neither time-consuming nor difficult to do, which left her plenty of time to inquire as to the state of mind of everyone. Oh, some of them she could guess. Poor Captain Rogers had to be utterly beside himself for one, and the reminder of being held captive would not be at all fun for several of the others. Most of them, actually, once she thought about it. She was relatively certain that just about every Avenger had been in enemy hands at least one point in their lives. While she didn't know for a fact that anyone other than Sergeant Barnes, Loki, and Mr. Stark had been in enemy hands, it made sense. Beyond that, however, May didn't know any of them well enough to guess at how they were dealing with the situation at hand. Fortunately, May's trap was neatly set. She'd yet to meet the person who couldn't be lured in by the smell of good food cooking. The Avengers would, if anything, be more susceptible to the ploy than most, due to many of them having higher than normal metabolisms and all of them having been very active the day before. Also, the relative rarity of homemade cooking in many of their lives. So it wasn't long before the first Avenger followed their nose into the common floor kitchen. Better, it was Captain Rogers who showed up first. And he had Sergeant Barnes dogging his heels. May had to forcefully restrain herself from showing her outright horror. She'd seen horrifically abused dogs with more life in them. The sergeant was blank-faced and empty-eyed to the point of almost seeming to be simple, and he was hunched in on himself a little, like he was expecting to get hit, or worse. Given what he had doubtlessly been through, it wasn't all that surprising. But it was utterly horrifying to see. But May knew better than to show it, or to give in to the urge to cuddle and coddle the man. Well, to a point. She was, given his body language, sure that a physical approach would not be welcomed, but he wasn't going to get much of a choice on other forms of sympathy and assistance. "Something smells good," Steve said. Where the sergeant was empty of any facial expression, Steve was wearing a pinched, stressed, squinty look. And for all he was talking to May, he didn't seem to be able to look away from the sergeant for more than a few seconds at a time, concern flickering across his face every few moments in addition to the rest. "Just the sauce that's part of dinner," May said, making an effort to keep her voice normal. "I've got fresh bread rising too. I just need to decide on a vegetable or two." She had to work rather hard to keep from smiling at Steve's wide-eyed look. For a moment, the stress melted away, which made it all worth it. Even the sergeant reacted slightly, cocking his head just a bit and looking faintly curious for half a second. "I didn't think anyone made their own bread anymore," Steve said, then got a bashful look on his face. "Any chance of parsnips?" "You've just not been talking to the right people, Captain," May told him. "I'll admit that folks making their own bread is rarer than it was even back when I was a girl, but people do still make their own bread. And I can definitely handle parsnips. And maybe some mashed potatoes." Parsnips these days were more or less a niche vegetable. Very few people, relatively speaking, even liked them, never mind knew how to cook them. But there had been a time when root vegetables, which included parsnips, had been the staple vegetables of most folks' diets. Root vegetables, kept for weeks or even months without needing to resort to refrigeration, were generally very easy to grow, and you got a good number of them from even a small patch of garden. Refrigerators had been extremely new when Steve was a boy, and not yet something found in nearly every home in the country. Between that and the Depression and rationing, pretty much everyone ate mass quantities of root vegetables. May glanced up again. "Are there any parsnips on hand, Jarvis, or are we going to have to send out for some?" She'd spotted enough potatoes to feed an army earlier, so no need to ask about them. "I shall have to send out for some," Jarvis admitted. "That's quite all right. We've the time to spare," May said, then grinned at the two men. "Though I'll be setting you two loose on the potatoes. It's going to take a while to peel and cut up enough for everyone." Steve grimaced as he eyed the sergeant significantly. "I don't know." May understood what Steve was getting at, but she was willing to bet that having something definite to do that had nothing to do with mayhem, blood, and death would do the poor man a world of good right now. She understood Steve's desire to coddle the man, but that was going to backfire sooner rather than later. "Nonsense! He'll be fine," May said, then pointed at Sergeant Barnes. "You sit here." She patted one of the bar stools at the enormous island. He instantly obeyed her. May pointed to Steve. "You go get the potatoes. There's 2 bushel baskets of them in the pantry." For a moment, Steve wanted to object. He didn't like seeing Bucky like this, blank and lifeless and... And the idea of ordering Bucky around gave Steve hives, almost literally. He just couldn't do it. Couldn't treat Bucky like that. Even when there was a part of him that understood and even agreed with the idea that Bucky would need to be ordered around sometimes to get through the day, he just couldn't do it. It was the part of him that understood that kept the words behind his teeth. If he couldn't, he had no choice but to let others do it for him. It helped that Steve knew no one here would be mean to Bucky when it came to giving him orders. So Steve headed into the pantry and hauled the bushels of potatoes out. Over the next few hours, Steve very privately decided that he liked May Parker. A lot. She shot him a lot of horrified and sympathetic looks, but made absolutely sure to do so only where Bucky couldn't see her. When she dealt with Bucky, she was firm but kind, and there wasn't a hint anywhere in her tone of anything amiss. Bucky followed her orders, of course. The best part was that by the time supper was ready to be put on the table, Bucky had a bit more life in him. He still wasn't talking, not even via sign language, but he didn't look so blank and lifeless anymore. And in the meantime, Steve had found himself doing a lot of talking. Wasn't like he didn't have time for it, sitting there and peeling potatoes by the gross. Something about May sort of encouraged you to talk to her. Steve had noticed the same thing with Sam. Maybe it was their open, easygoing personalities. Though, if the tales he'd heard were to be believed, May could be quite a firecracker when necessary. He'd heard about her bawling Peter out over being Spider-Man when he didn't even know if it was safe to use his newly acquired abilities. And even though Steve hadn't bared his soul, or whatever you wanted to call it, they'd stuck with completely innocuous subjects. He, rather weirdly, felt a little bit better. Maybe it was as simple as May being old enough to have been his mother if he'd been born in this era, and having that mom heir to her. She bore little to no resemblance to Steve's actual mom, but talking to her did remind him of the times he'd gone to his mother with his troubles. Whatever it was, it worked. About 2 seconds after the last dish hit the table, they got invaded. Literally everyone showed up. Which was, Steve was fairly sure, the first time that had happened since the would-be invasion. No, wait. Steve was pretty sure everyone had been bullied into eating at the same time by Darcy the day after Bucky had been brought into the tower. He wasn't absolutely certain, though, because he had not exactly been paying attention at the time.
I'm pretty sure Thanksgiving is in November,
John Allardyce said after staring at the table for a moment.
because this seriously looks more like that sort of spread than, a normal dinner.
Rogue, who was standing next to him, elbowed him sharply, and he blushed a bit.
I would comment, holy shit, how did you cook all this in less than a day? And also, thank you.
Language, young man, May scolded, though her tone was quite mild. I'm aware you're surrounded by inveterate hooligans, but that does not mean you have to emulate them. Steve joked on a laugh. Most of the gang looked like they wanted to object, but realized they'd be lying through their teeth if they did. $10? She starts a swear jar. Steve heard someone whisper, their voice low enough he couldn't properly identify the whisperer, though he was betting on Tony because it came from that general direction. Steve figured that for a sucker's bet. Though good luck getting this lot to clean up their language, including him. He might not cuss as often as the rest, but that didn't mean he didn't cuss at all, after all. All that said, he really didn't blame John for wondering if Thanksgiving had come early because there was quite a spread of homemade dishes on the table. Several huge casserole dishes of what May had said was a baked beef stroganoff, beans, corn on the cob, the parsnips he'd asked for, and enough mashed potatoes to float an aircraft carrier in stood alongside dishes of several types of pickles and olives. A plate of sliced up cucumbers, carrots, bell peppers, and tomatoes sat on the table, as well as several enormous bowls of salad that already had carrots, cheese, cucumbers, bits of red cabbage, onions, and tomatoes in it. Homemade bread fresh out of the ovens, and Steve knew they weren't on the table at the moment. A bunch of berry pies for dessert rounded things out. The sound of several stomachs snarling in unison broke the tableau, and had pretty much everyone laughing as they all scrambled for seats.